open line. Of course, you've been speaking around different issues of the day.
Let's have the conversation. WhatsApp voice notes on 0614 104 107.
Morning, Cathy and the listeners. Mr. Ramaphosa, you were singing Tumamina just before he took over. But today, he can't take responsibility. He is always shifting the post. In Botaville.
Why not say who is being chased like a devil? There are many people in ANC who are corrupt. Lots of names. The names that were presented by the director to Mufmati, but now he doesn't reveal them. And others implicated in the Zondo Commission. Maybe there's something behind. I don't say she is innocent. Regarding the clip you play, it's trying to canvass for votes. We are the present and the future. We want service delivery. We are dying like flies. Jails are hotels. No jobs, no roads, no water, load shedding. Thank you, Cathy.
Hi, Cathy. This is KM. Concerning the corruption allegation of the Speaker of the Nation, Nosiviwe, you know what? It's so sad. It's unfortunate, because the people who are running this country, it seems as if they are all corrupt. I'm sorry to say that. Batabile Dlamini once said, everybody has a little skeleton in the closet. We took her lightly, but the things are manifesting themselves now. Thank you very much.
Hi, Cathy. I hope you're well. I need to remind you about this Mapisa Ngakula. The lady, when she was a defense minister, she flew in a lady from some African country saying that her father was abusing her, and which turned out to be a lie. And I don't know what happened, to that case. And she even had the audacity to say that she would do it again. So I don't know. I don't even understand how somebody, could defend her in this case. I don't know. I don't know what to think. Good day.
Hi, Cathy. I'm at that age now that I work with young people who are of the same age as my children. And two contrasting, one of them just called me by name, straight by name. And the other one came to ask, how should I address you? And look, I'm not offended. If the young man calls me by name, or the young man calls me by, a certain prefix, whatever prefix they choose, the one who asked me ended up calling me sir, and I call him son. And the other one calls me by name, and I call him by name. It's not a prefix or with or without prefix. It's the manner of approach. It is the manners of a person that matters. Yeah, it's Wiseman here from Johannesburg. Bye.
SAFM values your views. Be an active citizen. Cathy Mohlahlana on SAFM.
Thanks for those WhatsApp voice notes. Wiseman, thank you too for sharing that story. In fact, perhaps that's the better way to do it, right? Especially if one finds themselves in the work environment, maybe to approach the people that, are elder and to say, well, how would you like that I refer to you? What is your preference? Rather than making assumptions. Because as one of our listeners said earlier, the world has moved on and things are changing quite rapidly. But yeah, some of us still have our grandmother's voices somewhere at the back of our minds, waiting for you to slip up and get it wrong. All right. On that note, we're going to get into our second conversation of the day, and we're dealing with the issue of racism. And the question we're asking this morning is, What makes it difficult to deal with racism in South Africa? Why are we still seemingly having the same conversation or similar conversations over and over again without yielding really the kind of results that we want to see? And what would those results be? That we don't get reports of people in the workplace calling other people, using derogatory terms to describe them, treating them in a way that is clearly prejudicial, unfair, and that makes one feel that their dignity has not been respected. That's probably one of the biggest contributions that came out of part one of this conversation. And it was made by Terry, who said, well, racism is not necessarily about the intention of the person that is accused of it, but it is also about the impact of the individual and how they receive particular behaviors, how it makes them feel. And as long as somebody is made to feel a particular way, then it is racism. So we shouldn't be focusing so much on those that are the offenders, but rather those that are the victims. For our conversation today, we're joined by Hassan Logat. He's a social justice activist. Hassan, good morning to you. All right, I'm struggling to hear Hassan. Hassan, just make sure that you're not on mute there.
Good morning, Cathy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear now.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Sure, thank you so much for making time for us. Rethabile Ratsomo is an anti-racism program manager at the Kathrada Foundation. Rethabile, good morning.
Morning, Cathy. Thank you so much for having me this morning.
And Professor Roger Southall is Professor Emeritus in Sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand. Prof, good morning.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
Thank you all for making time for this conversation. Before we get into it, though, I really just want to bring a bit of a refresher, especially also for the benefit of our listeners that were not part of the first part of this conversation, and bring you some of the reflections that we kicked off with. And of course, we kicked off with how to deal with racism in the workplace in particular. We were joined in this conversation by Terry Oakley-Smith, who is the MD of Diversity, Dr. Joe Owen, who is with the University of the Free State, Dr. Shahida Johnson, who's a clinical psychologist, and Trifina Mubai, who's an HR specialist. So let's listen to what they had to say.
What we don't always understand is that, yes, there's a code of conduct, but does that code of conduct have meaning for those people working in the workplace? We've also encountered each other for decades, centuries. There are ways in which we've organized ourselves, one of it being in respect of race. As an anthropologist, I would ask, is race as a biological fact real? Questionable? In respect of sociocultural meaning, is it real? Yes. So while biologically we do not divide human beings into races, culturally it has meaning. And specifically in South Africa, we know that. Things that we might consider innocuous in certain spaces becomes extremely harmful where you have different people within that space. It's very hard to navigate because we don't know each other's intention. We read the situation based on what we understand race to be. And because race, in essence, in South Africa became cultural and became culture, it's very difficult to try to make sense of our everyday engagements with each other now in the 21st century.
We shouldn't be looking at the person's intention. We should be looking at the impact it has. So assuming it's a white person saying something racist to a black person, quite frankly, it doesn't matter if the white person means it or doesn't mean it or said it by mistake. What is of critical importance is how it makes the black person feel. And that's what makes it racist. And I think we spend far too much time listening to white people saying, oh, I didn't mean it. I'm married to a black person. I would never say such a thing. And in fact, that's not the issue. The issue is, how did it make the black person or the biracial person or the colored person or the Indian person feel. That's where we should be putting our energy.
My sense is that there always has to be a victim when we have these conversations. There always has to be a victim, and there always has to be an oppressor. And we never really look at how oppressed we still feel, even if it is psychologically, economically, we still feel it, and we don't consider what that oppression looks like on both sides.
It's not just psychological, but it's also deeply spiritual. It goes to the depth of who we are. You know, often we start with what makes us different. So especially when we talk about racism, and of course we are different. We've had almost 400 years of difference, 50 years of apartheid. So all we've ever, learned about is how we're different. In what way are we the same? And this is for me where models of the self, models of local people's understanding of who we are, because research confirms that most people in South Africa, irrespective of what race or ethnicity we are, we see ourselves in relational terms. Can we first agree on a common theory of what makes us human?
My belief is that it should start at the very top. The top management should start by displaying diversity, by displaying equity, by displaying inclusivity. In that way, the people that are following them will then be able to realize that actually racism is not welcomed in this place.
All right, so those were just some of the reflections that were kicked off by our panel last week. And following that conversation, one did get a sense that there is a lot of tiptoeing on the issue of racism. So it seems difficult for us to address it, especially where it exists in a more formal environment. Remember, we kicked off the conversation looking at racism in the workplace. And while there are companies that have done well to develop policies, to follow up on reported incidents, it does seem that by and large, there are ways in which people feel racism exists in the workplace, but it is not dealt with, and they feel unable to actually officially raise it. Hassan, why is it so difficult to deal with racism in our country, but especially when it exists in a formal environment?
Well, thanks, Cathy. Racism in this country has its roots in our history. I mean, we wouldn't be having whites here if we didn't have mines and the discovery of gold and diamonds. So they came through as workers from Ireland and various places, and venture capitalists were here. So it brought through those people. The Brits, when they colonized, brought through Indian workers, by ship, to work on the sugar canes, etc. So the economy remains an important area to locate our discussion around racism. But what you find post-94 is a number of powerfully organized, largely white interest groups, right, have been trying to suggest almost that racism does not exist, or to use the word of a 2021 billboard by the South African Institute of Race Relations, which they put on the Joburg Freeway. Racism is not the problem, they say. If you look at John Steenhuisen being interviewed by by Manas on Palestine, he said it is not one person's genocide, is another person's freedom fighting, he says. So, and then he proceeded to say that it's not about racism, genocide, and those kind of things. The issue for him is the economy and efficiency and non-corruption, etc. And going back to this billboard, they basically relied also on the scientific research, so-called, by interviewing about a small number of people, 2,000 some odd people, to try and find out what the problems were, right? And they, at that time already in 2022, the survey, they found out that unemployment, crime, corruption, which are the issues that, for example, some of the more privileged parties are campaigning on. But monopoly capitalism that the Anglo-American government, elites, the Oppenheimers introduced, was fundamentally corrupt. They owned half the economy, if not all, right? That black people for years were paid peanut wages. In fact, the TRC heard how in 1897, the mining companies met and they made an agreement among themselves, a kind of a cabal pact, that there will be a maximum average wage they'll pay black workers. This was only reversed in the 1970s. Black workers were denied trade union rights for over 70 years, while white workers had formal trade union rights. So when they talk to us about corruption, they must locate it within apartheid, at how people had to fight for basic dignities, which the Constitution now grants them. But unfortunately, our movements are not that strong enough to kind of keep people accountable. So I think, yes, racism is tough, but as a political play now where others are trying to tell us that our emotions are false, that what we need to worry about is just that the potholes are fixed, and that our human dignity is about not having a job, which the bosses have to help. You can't just blame government, because capitalists create jobs. Where's the patriotism of the Steenhuisens and others? Why is there a kind of selectivity about whom they care for? Why would he go to Ukraine and mourn the death of a few kids and then ignore the death of Palestinians? This is at the heart of whether these parties are human and care about the racism and anti-racism in the society and how they can work on it. They almost outsource this fight to be that of the ruling party or maybe the EFF, whom they then can say that these guys are falsely raising the issues of racism. 30 years we are living under this new efforts. Of course, there's been a lot of shortcomings, but in the backdrop of 300, and your program last week spoke about 400 years of colonial and apartheid exploitation. Right. So it's clearly quite complex.
Rethabile, let me give you an opportunity to weigh in on the question we're asking this morning then. Why is it so difficult, in your view, to deal with racism in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Cathy, for the question. I do have to agree with some of the points that Hassan has raised, understanding what it is when we speak about the history of this country and colonial and apartheid being mixed within these 400 years. I think it's when it comes to interpersonal racism, I think we often see in media that kind of issue being dealt with. There's a lot of different avenues for people to explore there. But I think in terms of where we face challenges, I think as South Africa, we haven't really established a way or intentional, direct, consistent efforts to address structural racism. I think the structural racism that continues to exist within institutions, within public bodies, I think is where we're at in terms of addressing racism. And I think the lack of effort in coordinating efforts around that sees us still being in a situation where we hear of the incidences happening at workplaces. We hear about how people feel like they're not welcome or included in the kinds of environments that they work in. So I think that I think would be my contribution to that question.
And Rethabile, before I let you go on for this particular round, the fact that the problem we're dealing with is structural in nature, what is it that, again, in more formal environments, would need to be done to recognize it as such? Because ultimately, people talk about what their experiences are, and it is these experiences that are often shut down. Hassan says that it's, we're told about false emotions, and yet for the person who's gone through the emotion, it's not false at all. It is a very real feeling. How can we identify what that feeling is in formal language?
Yeah, I think I would go back to the point that was raised in the recap of last week's episode, where Fiona mentioned that, as organizations, you'll have a code of conduct for employees, which really tries to balance the interests of all. But I think, that disjunction between whether or not that code of conduct actually translates into reality in a way that and make sure that in the environment that people are in is inclusive, that's where I think the difficulty begins. And I think in having conversations with the people who may feel excluded or who may feel as though, they enter a workplace that is discriminatory, I think that would be able to inform just how it is that we go about fixing that kind of formal gap in communication. But I think also it's just our understanding. It comes to our understanding what it means to be, racist and anti-racist, because I think it's my opinion and the opinion of the foundation as well that, being an anti-racist is not something that exists as an endpoint. If you're doing something at that moment in time, whether you're a black person, whether you're a white person, whether you're colored or Indian, that should be viewed as racist, despite what the intention may be behind that. And I think just understanding when we speak about anti-racism, what we're speaking about, I think will then also be able to inform policies, because policies also should be able to be live documents where, if it does no longer serve the purpose that it was meant to serve, we're able to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this is where we need to address the gaps. So I think, starting from that kind of angle, I think would be helpful in addressing some of the racism we see in workplaces.
Professor Southall, let me give you a chance to come in and perhaps kick it off just with your own reflections on this question we're asking today.
Yeah, there were 2 points I'd like to make. First of all, obviously, the issue of the economy. And I think that one of the things that perhaps needs highlighting is that much of the discussion about racism happens within what we might call within the middle class, because we have experienced over the last 20, 30 years a relatively high rate of upward mobility by Black South Africans into the middle class. And it is in the workplace we're talking about where many of the encounters about racism take place. Previously, under apartheid, you wouldn't have had so many racial encounters within the middle class, if so to speak. So I think that's one thing. And related to that, of course, is for the whole issue of precarity. You were talking about why people are frightened about raising racial issues in the workplace. One is because the workplace is highly precarious. If you lose your job in a society with 30 to 35% unemployment, you're losing your livelihood. You can't easily swap into another job. So I think there is that fear about the issue. If I can come back to Hassan's point about the IIR, the Institute of Race Relations surveys, I think quite a few methodological objections have been raised to the way in which the surveys are conducted. I think I'm correct in saying, and I may be subject to correction, that the IIR asks individual respondents to rank their major concerns from unemployment through this, that, and the other, and racism. Now, if you are unemployed, probably your major concern is going to be unemployment rather than racism. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have a concern with racism. So I think that's one issue that needs to be dealt with. And in that same issue, you're talking about the DA and John Steenhuisen's response to racism, etc. I think one of the issues which we have seen coming out over the last few years is effectively this glass ceiling within the DA. You have a fair number of Black South Africans who are attracted to the DA's program. And you find over the years you have had quite a number of Black rising stars within the DA. But it has become quite a habit for them to reach a certain level and then to peel away from the party, claiming that there is a sort of white cabal or something. And unfortunately, the DA, which claims with some justification in terms of its membership complexion to be a highly diverse party, has never really resolved this issue about Black mobility into senior positions. Once it got rid of Musi Maimane, there seemed to be a reversion in its approach. And I think that that's something that the DA really has to answer to. And At the moment, we're not seeing that response.
Yeah. All right. We're going to continue the conversation in a moment. It's time for us to take the latest news headlines. Professor Roger Southall, Rethabile Radzomo, and Hassan Logat will be with us when we continue on the other side of this.
Good morning, Cathy. With your news headlines, I am Luyanda Maume. The fourth accused in the disappearance of 6-year-old Jocelyn Smith will be back before the Vredenburg Magistrates Court in the Western Cape on May 13th. 32-year-old Laurentia Lombard abandoned her bail application when she made a second appearance in court this morning. The Senzo Meiwameda trial will resume this morning in the High Court in Pretoria with the cross-examination of an Electronic National Administration Traffic Information Systems or INATIS expert. Christopher Matlow earlier refuted claims from one of the accused, Muzi Sibia, that he was not in Gauteng between 2013 and 2015. And the Eastern Cape government says it has seen a significant improvement in the performance of some of its municipalities. This follows the introduction of the risk-adjusted strategy in municipalities during the 2023-24 financial year. I'll have details on these and other stories at 11. Cathy has your SAFM market update.
Taking a look at the markets this morning, the rand is currently trading at 18 rand 96 to the dollar, 23 rand 91 to the pound, and 20 rand 51 to the euro. Markets in Asia closed weaker, the JSE lower in mid-morning trade. Markets in Europe also flat this hour. Gold is trading at $2,167, platinum $901 per ounce. The price of Brent crude oil is at $85.80 a barrel.
Rising costs, housing prices, fuel price hikes, diminished consumer buying power, inflation. It's a jungle out there. Who do you trust when the only certainty is uncertainty? You need an investment team who considers it all to give you the advantage. At Prescient Investment Management, we analyze more than 120 million indicators daily because the biggest returns are found in the smallest insights. Discover the future of investing at prescient.co.za. Prescient Investment Management is a registered FSP.
Fly better to your next holiday. Book your flights with Emirates to a holiday in Dubai, London, Istanbul, or Paris. Look forward to delicious regionally inspired cuisine. Enjoy free-flowing premium drinks and relax to your favorite movies on the way. Because it's not just about the destination, it's how you get there. This year, fly Emirates. Fly better.
Well, it was nice. You were enjoying that song, but now it's over. Just like drinking and driving, a promising future could end in a split second. Don't drink and drive. You will get caught. Make the better choice. #don't do it. It's a message brought to you by aware.org and the Road Traffic Management Corporation.
Cathy Mohlahlana on SAFM.
We continue the conversation on the talking point this morning. We're talking about what makes it difficult to deal with racism in the country. Our guest, Hassan Logat, he's a social justice activist. Rethabile Radzomo is an anti-racism program manager at the Kathrada Foundation. And Professor Roger Southall is Professor Emeritus in Sociology at the University of Witwatersrand. I'll, of course, also be taking your contributions to our conversation in about 10 minutes or so. You can call in on 086 000 2032. That's the number to dial. 086 000 2032. On the WhatsApp voice note line 0614 104 107. That's where you can send your text messages and WhatsApp voice notes. So, Hassan, I think, you know, obviously all of you have had the opportunity just to reflect on the conversation and understand the point that you're making primarily around, corruption that has existed in corporate South Africa, white-collar crime, as some would put it, often that has gone underreported, undealt with. But to the extent that it affects attitudes and behaviors in the workplace and makes it difficult for other people then to get on with their jobs, surely 30 years after the fact, we must have developed ways of actually dealing with those kind of behaviors, because these are the very same behaviors that some would say lead to a group of people being paid more than another group of people for doing exactly the same job. And I know it's a broad generalization here, but there is this perception, and it is very much a lived experience of South Africans who say, I'm a young black South African. I'm in this job in a big company. And yet my counterpart, who does exactly what I do, is white, is getting paid close on double what I'm getting paid. How do I see that and not interpret it and think that it is racism? And there are many other examples that I can give. But there doesn't seem to be a way of identifying it as such within corporate, because HR has very fancy languages, or fancy language for how they describe it and what they actually call it.
Yeah. Cathy, you know, my take is that the system of racism is a system of power, and how it controls, if you like, broadly the natives, the indigenous people, the workers, the ones who've come through as indenture, those who origins from slaves in the Western Cape, etc. So it's about how to keep the natives in check. And that model, where the colonial powers would tie us up in trade relations with them, that in the workplace itself has not been totally transformed. So we are still destined to trade with overseas partners. We don't look at our sub-regional economy, our own economy. Now there's a new gold rush around critical raw materials, as they call them, looking at lithium and all such materials that are essential to making batteries and electric motor vehicles, etc. And now everyone, the US and China, everyone is battling over this relation. What we need to do, and what we ought to have done, was to turn away from that apartheid colonial model into a model that will sustain us and our neighbors, because even these borders are kind of artificial. So when you beat up your neighbor who's also Sesotho speaking or Setswana speaking, is actually a mockery. So we need to rethink that whole economy. But at the dawn of our democracy, providing homes for people and providing jobs is what the Harare Declaration spoke about. Madiba, in his inaugural speech for the Constitution, adopting of the Constitution, promised to people that there will be jobs, etc., and also a living wage, right? So in fact, to quote his words very directly, he says, "Our own humble contribution to democracy and culture of human rights worldwide, and is our pledge for humanity that will steer us away. Nothing will steer us away from this cause. Everything will understand that we are committed to the mandate from the overwhelming majority of our people." So the question is whether our government has probably put its foot off the pedal, because he went on to say we must address the question of joblessness and homelessness to build all the facilities that we have enjoyed for the centuries by a tiny minority. So that was his challenge that he put when we adopted the Constitution. So clearly we have not done that, but we have not done it because of our own weaknesses, also being duped by neoliberal politics, because you cannot build an anti-racist state under conditions of extreme capitalism. Just is not possible. And the DA and others want us to move faster in that direction of efficiencies, etc., which will not redress these challenges that we've had from 100 years, but even the last 40, 50 years.
Professor Southall, of course, you've got very specific views around why it is we don't necessarily have this non-racial consensus that, the likes of Hassan is referring to, that Madiba and the constitutional order were supposed to bring in.
Well, this is actually a very complicated issue, and I think one has to look at it quite historically. Look, I quite agree with what Hassan was saying about global inequality, which we know is becoming more extreme in terms of the accumulation of wealth by a class of super billionaires globally. And that obviously has its reflections at a global level with the countries of the global south, which are primarily black and brown, being essentially economically subordinated to countries of the global north, which are overwhelmingly white. That doesn't mean that I don't think that in South Africa we have not made any progress since 1994. I would dispute that. I think that in many ways, the conversations we're having about racism in the workplace are at one level an indicator of how far we come, because these would not have happened before 1994. And I think we need to recall that. If you go to many workplaces, there is a pretty functional relationship between people of different backgrounds. And what happens is when people become offended because there has been, I think as one of your people last week were talking about, cultural misinterpretations and a feeling by people that they have not been listened to and that they have been oppressed. So I think we need to bear that in mind, that when we're having this conversation, racism continues to exist. It will do. I think we must. It's very difficult. I think we talk about a non-racial society, which is an aspiration. But as with most aspirations, we're never actually going to reach it. That doesn't mean that we stop trying.
What then do we do in the here and now, Professor Southall? Because in the present that we are living in, as we've all touched on, is the fact that people are having to live with whatever incidents of racism they might be exposed to within formal environments. And that level of lack of empowerment, disempowerment to deal with it exists. There also doesn't seem to be any clear will that they will be supported right through to the end if they carry through some of these matters, right? Because you want to know that if I raise an issue, I will have the support that I need institutionally, and if I don't have it institutionally, I will find it on the outside. But if I'm understanding both you and Hassan, and what you're saying is that there is a level of co-opting that has taken place, which is why it becomes difficult to deal with the issue of racism.
Yeah, look, I think, and this is going into an area which is not my expertise, the whole issue of, at one level, the internal workings of corporations and how they deal with employment issues. And I referred to precarity earlier. I think people are, first of all, frightened of losing their jobs, encounters and so forth. But it is how corporations and employers deal with it. And we have a whole set of processes laid out in the law and so forth in this country. It's whether those are adhered to and the way in which companies respond. And these can be extremely long-term and legalistic. And that too is an issue. So I suppose I'm a little bit of a loss here. How you actually deal with it if you are subject to racism? I suppose one should be trying to raise it, but if you're frightened, you're in a bit of a catch-22. So I think there are these difficulties in the workplace, which very much relate to the precarity of job situations.
Mm-hmm. All right. David, you're calling us from Uppington. Good morning. Good morning, David.
Hello.
Hi.
Morning, Cathy.
Yes. Good, thank you.
I'm good. Thanks, Cathy. Cathy, the views expressed by the Prof and your guest, they actually give a very big picture and a scary one on various fronts in terms of dealing with the, I'll call it a pandemic of its own nature. Precisely because racism has been actually been described by the United Nations to say it's a crime against humanity. In particular, for me, against the African majority.
And Cathy, what is actually frustrating about this? Because I agree with the Prof. We've been discussing this on various platforms and what, but for me, the diplomats or the academia that discuss this does not actually delve into. It seems that they are afraid to delve into the deep divisions that has been caused by the apartheid, actually sort of enforcing racism to the extent where it actually now finds its expression up until today. So my take on that, Cathy, is that what the other gentleman just raised now, in terms of how racism actually was glorified during the apartheid years, and how white-collar crime was advanced by the apartheid government, and now, given that we are in this new democracy, new dispensation, a new era of that opens up for people to accept one another in terms of their diversity, their race, and so forth. And that actually, Cathy, has been actually swept under the carpet, because for us to deal with racism, we need to go back. We need to delve into the apartheid. How did they actually sort of manifest and successfully so, making sure that people up until today, they still find themselves struggling with the issue of racism, and people are still subscribing to the practices of racism that were actually instilled by the apartheid regime.
All right. David, thanks for the call and your contribution. He's out in Uppington. Retabile, as the Kathrada Foundation, you spend quite a lot of time also going out into communities, holding workshops and dialogues on this very issue of racism. To David's point, what have you found around trying to understand why it is that these patterns of behaviors, these views still exist, even though we're supposed to be long gone and done with that? The racism is supposed to be a thing of the past, at least 30 years old by now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's different aspects to that kind of question, but I think also just in general, post 1994, I'm not sure outside of the TRC processes whether or not we actually dealt with the racism that, was fed from a bottom-down system. I think even now, 30 years post-democracy, as much as we don't have formalized racial laws, the manifestations of racism are still very apparent. And I think the lack of will in being able to address those kinds of things, but also people not being aware of the issue. I think post-1994, a lot of us maybe were lulled into a sense of, racism doesn't necessarily exist anymore, as people were all beautiful, and the rainbow nation of South Africa. But I think in that understanding, you're missing the opportunity to address these kinds of issues directly. So when it comes to, institutional and systemic racism, we miss the opportunity to say, although these institutions have existed, before 1994, in what way do we revitalize those cultures to be more inclusive? So I think those kinds of things. And I think also just in terms of learning about our history, I think, the 2000s are very no, we don't need to learn about our history because, it's not something that affects us anymore, without understanding that if they don't understand the issue, they themselves then cannot contribute to tackling it. So I think also misunderstanding of what it is when we still talk about racism today, but also the inability for people to actually reckon with some of the racist things that are happening and then actively choose to not perpetuate those same things further.
This denialism around the existence of racism, do you think that it exists more within formal spaces than informal spaces? Is it harder, let's say, in an office in corporate South Africa, for people to bring up the subject of race and have a conversation about race?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like was mentioned earlier, we're really starting to see these divisions happen in spaces that are more diverse. So we see it happening, in schools that have more of a diverse demographic. We see it happening in the workplace because, it's not just one race that's there. And I think in those moments, it's very difficult then to balance both people's interests, because people will then go into this thing of, well, I'm not trying to be racist. But when you answer and respond in that kind of way, you're divorcing racism and the understanding of racism, and how it's intertwined into a system of power. So I think, like was mentioned by the professor before, these issues won't be dealt with in the workplace unless there is an approach from the top all the way to the bottom that says that in these environments, racism is not tolerable, So unless we're getting that kind of will or, initiative, we're not seeing these issues being dealt with the kind of, whether you're going to say aggression or consequences that are needed to be able to address this. And it's not just stemming from, people who are big in corporate or people who have the power to make decisions in corporate. I think even with our own government, we've seen the kind of lack of political will in addressing this in a broader way. I mean, yes, we can talk about the National Action Plan, but that took 18 years for it to come into development. And even then, it's a small number of people who are dealing with its implementation. So the lack of will, I think, is something we're seeing throughout just all factors of society. And if it's not also something that is being led by our politicians, then it's something that is very hard to then bring down to a level where other people also realize how important it is.
All right. Thanks for that contribution, Retabile. I want to take some of the voice notes that have been sent through on the WhatsApp line, and then I'll also squeeze in a few more calls.
Dealing with its implementation is something we're seeing that is being led by our politicians, and it's something that is very hard to.
I'm not actually sure what is happening there. It looks like we've crossed some of our lines, so I'm going to leave this particular monitor while they try to sort it out. Jay, you're in Somerset West. Good morning.
Yes, hi. I think it's more classism, which actually the Hindu people practice, because if I have a choice between a white person in South Africa and, say, a black person who's Christian, I will take the black Christian's side. So it's actually classism, and it's also religion. Now, in Sudan, we have 7 million people starving to death, but the United Nations only cares about one country. They had 50 to 100 trucks for the last 10 years going into Gaza, which Hamas turned into weapons. And yet the people in Africa having their limbs cut off by Al-Shabaab, and they are in a terrible state. But the United Nations doesn't care about the Christians in Sudan because, one, they're Christian, and second, they're black. But I care about them. And as for Israel, Israel took in an Operation Moses 10 years ago, 10,000 African Ethiopians who said they were Jewish. Now today, there are 150,000. They also died by Hamas's hand. They also lost loved ones. In the army, they're everywhere. They were integrated and are treated like everybody else in Israel. So I don't want to hear about this apartheid thing in Israel, because Israel has black people who are Israeli. Okay. So they must cut the apartheid, these Muslims.
Oh, wow. Jay, oh my gosh. Oh. Yeah, sometimes we can be so vile on air. I think we just need to tone it down a little bit, Jay, just so that we're able to actually get on with the purposes of having meaningful and constructive conversation. Stephen, you're in Soweto. Good morning.
Yes, and see your guest there as well. It's very painful that racism, especially in the remuneration disparities, is so rise, especially in the banks. And you look at that, all these 4 major banks, I think at one point had the African CEOs, and yet they didn't do any dent on that. It's so painful, Cathy, because in one of the private banks, besides the 4 major ones, there was someone who was actually, paid 800,000 and hasn't been in that bank for less than, 8 months, and yet she didn't have the qualifications, but because of her color, right? And I wonder what is the labor ministry is doing about this. Is it about, I'm actually with them, and I cannot just actually try and uplift the lives of others through ensuring that they get paid what is applicable to the job, not to that color.
All right.
Lastly, Kathy.
Very briefly, Stephen, yeah?
When Stephen, when there was a brouhaha about AGOA, remember AGOA is one of those that are actually, its companies are still paying people based on their color, not as to what they're actually producing. So the people were actually running to the state to say, look, if ever you stop AGOA, it means our lifestyle are going to depreciate. Thanks for the time, kids.
All right. Okay, Stephen. Stephen out in Soweto. Hassan, we're quickly running out of time. 45 seconds for you to give your final.
Yeah, Cathy, I think that the regulatory bodies, the Chapter 9s, the Human Rights Commission and the Gender Commission really have to jack up so that they can tackle complaints beyond individual persons' hurts and grievances. There are systemic big issues that we need to deal with. But, partly why racism prevails is that it existed before capitalism and now it continues. And that most of the people that we work with in mining communities still live next to a mine dump, tailings dam, and waste of the mines. So those legacies of apartheid continue today, and they still die younger than other people living in the north. So racism is real. As regards those Islamophobic comments, I don't think they deserve a response, but I do think that the unions were a critical player in bringing about transformation. It united civil society. It had a fixed program. The unions are not what they used to be before, and we wish for that day that they reorganize their zeal and willingness to organize society from below so that we can actually overcome this, yeah?
Prof?
Yes, I think the one thing which Jane implied, which I would agree with, is that the issue is about classes as much about race. I think one of the things we need to recognise is that we still have basically apartheid geography. And most of us live in communities which are largely of one complexion or another, and we meet in the workplace. Now, location is about class as much as it is about race. And it's about how much resources and power you accumulate as individuals. And so I think when we're next discussing this issue, we really need to be looking at class as much as race.
All right. Thanks for that. Retabile.
Yeah, I think I would just echo what, the previous speakers have said. I think nowadays when we talk about racism, it's very hard for us to divorce it from, socioeconomic privilege. But I think also as South Africans, it's important for us to learn about this issue of racism, but also then understand how it is that we take on the issue. I think a lot of South Africans aren't fully aware of how to utilize the tools and the mechanisms that have been put out there, whether it stems from PEPUDA, whether it stems from the Equality Code, whether it stems from, raising a complaint with the South African Human Rights Commission. I think people need to also be proactive in seeking these tools and resources and addressing this, and also being involved in organizations that actually attempt to tackle this issue. If you feel as though there's things that are not being said, bring yourself to a conversation where we are able to have these conversations so that when we do talk about anti-racism, it's something that is incorporative of everyone's perspective.
All right. Let me thank you all for your contributions to this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join model and TV personality Dr. Fezile and Dr. Anesu on Top Travel. Allow yourself to be taken on an exhilarating journey across Africa, redefining travel at its finest on our very own home turf. From the rolling green hills of the Eastern Cape to the breathtaking sapphire waters of the Kenyan coastline, the duo explores the diverse landscapes and cultures of the continent we call home. Channel your inner adventurer with Top Travel. Start Saturday the 23rd of March at 8:30 p.m. only on.
Think bigger than just a banking partner. Think a team of specialized experts supporting you to make better financial decisions to enable your growth aspirations. Think a strategic partnership providing indispensable advice to help you make the right moves. Think bigger. Think Nedbank Commercial Banking. For more information, visit nedbank.co.za. See money differently. Nedbank. We're a licensed FSP and registered credit provider.
SACE wishes all teachers a happy 2024 Human Rights Month and calls upon a stop to violence against our teachers. Teacher rights are human rights. Together we can create a brighter future for learners through safeguarding the rights of teachers. Hashtag Hands Off Our Teachers 2024 campaign. Proudly brought to you by SACE, the South African Council for Educators.
The Blues are looking for nothing but victory to cement a decent top half position.
Mudryk takes over. Mudryk's through. Mudryk round the goalkeeper. Oh, it's fantastic.
But the Clarets need full points to step out of the uncomfortable zone.
Come on, Jakob. Jakob Brun-Larsen scores. Burnley. Perfect penalty. Keeper went the right way. Too much on it.
This is the Premier League. Witness the superb contest between Chelsea FC and Burnley FC on Saturday 30 March at 4 p.m. live on S3. Also available on SABC Plus and SABCSport.com. Hashtag We Love It Here. Brought to you by SABC Sport. For the love of the game.
Independent and impartial. This is SAFM News.
In your top stories at 11, fourth suspect in the Jocelyn Smith case abandons bail, and the Eastern Cape government hails impact of the RAS on municipalities. This is SAFM News. A very good morning. I am Luyanda Maume. The fourth accused in the disappearance of 6-year-old Jocelyn Smith will be back before the Vredenburg Magistrates Court in the Western Cape on May 13th. 32-year-old Laurentia Lombard abandoned her bail application when she made a second appearance in court this morning. She has been remanded in custody. Jocelyn, a grade 1 learner, has still not been found. She went missing from her home in the Middelspos informal settlement in Saldanha over a month ago. Her mother, Kelly Smith, and 2 other co-accused had also abandoned their bail applications. They remain in custody until their next court appearance in May. All the accused face charges of trafficking in persons and kidnapping. The Senzo Meyiwa trial has resumed in the High Court in Pretoria with the cross-examination of an Electronic National Administration Traffic Information System or INETIS expert. Christopher Matlow earlier refuted claims from one of the accused, Muzi Sibiya, that he was not in Gauteng between 2013 and 2015. The court, however, heard that INETIS records show that Sibiya had applied for a learner's license twice in Brakpan and Boksburg in 2014. Sibiya and 4 co-accused face charges relating to the former Bafana captain's murder. Meyiwa was shot and killed in Vosloorus in the east of Johannesburg in October 2014. A girls' hostel has burnt down at the Makaula Senior Secondary School in KwaBhaca in the Eastern Cape. The incident happened while learners were attending classes on Saturday. Provincial Education spokesperson Vuyiseka Mbonxela says their district director in the Alfonso area will visit the school today to establish the extent of the damage.
Some learners lost their belongings, including school uniforms, and today the district director, Mr. Mbangeni, is going to visit that school so that he can give us a report of what needs to be done, and he most probably is going to go there with infrastructure inspectors so that they can get to assess the work that needs to be done there in terms of refurbishing the destroyed facilities.
Still in the Eastern Cape, the provincial government says it has seen a significant improvement in the performance of some of its municipalities. This follows the introduction of the risk-adjusted strategy in municipalities during the 2023-24 financial year. The program is aimed at resolving issues related to infrastructure development, expenditure and procurement. Local government MEC Zolile Williams has commended the OR Tambo District Municipality in particular.
We introduced the strategy with intent to expedite expenditure and stop municipalities from losing grants to the national fiscus. And having introduced it in the last financial year, we monitored it every quarter because the risk-adjusted strategy has quarterly targets. The expectation for municipalities is that they must have spent 30% of their total allocation in the first quarter of the financial year.
Let's conclude now with some election-related news. The African Transformation Movement leader Vuyolethu Zungula says his party would focus on creating jobs if it were voted into power. He was addressing ATM supporters during the launch of the party's Gauteng election campaign in Soweto.
Under the ATM government, we are going to ensure ukuba there is a local production of basic goods in our country. We can't be importing soap, toothpicks to an extent whereby everything we eat, we wear is made in other countries. As the ATM government, East South Africa is not going to be made in China country. Under the ATM government, most products in South Africa will be made in South Africa. That is how you create jobs. You build factories, you manufacture in that country. That is how you create jobs.
Recapping your top story, the fourth accused in the disappearance of 6-year-old Jocelyn Smith will be back before the Vredenburg Magistrates Court in the Western Cape on May 13th. For SAFM News, I am Luyanda Maume. Headlines at 11:30.
SAFM 104 to 107 nationwide, leading the conversation. The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday. Conversations that you connect with and react to. SAFM.
Cathy, I think we all know that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, with black people being the poor ones and white people still running the means of production. And that is the problem. As long as white people are still on top and them being the minority and black people still being poor and us being the majority, racism will never end. Racism is all about power, and whites in this country still have power. That's all there is to it. Black people have nothing, and white people are still in power. Thank you. Thabo from the Free State in Welkom.
Good morning, our Cathy and listeners. There's a lot I can say on this topic. I'll try to be brief. One, we have not had an honest and uncomfortable conversation about racism. We seem to be tiptoeing around white people so as not to hurt them, so as not to call them racist. When the company policies themselves, their actions in the workplace are racist. They might not use the K word, but their actions are racist. Two, there's this myth, this nonsense that is called reverse racism. Reverse racism does not exist. Not in a country where white people are complaining about affirmative action, yet a matriculant can be the supervisor and the manager of a black graduate, somebody with experience and qualification to do the job. All right, so I'll just leave it there for now.
Shalom Cathy, this is wisdom from Ndwedwe. Great is he that is inside of you than the one that is in the world. What is the meaning of that? It depends how you perceive yourself. What another person is saying and is doing, it doesn't matter. What matters the most is how you perceive yourself, is your attitude concerning yourself. That's the only way to block racism to have impact into your life. Why? Because racism, it will be always here. It will never go away. This is a manifestation of sinful nature in man. It's just that the manifestation of sinful nature, it varies in different people in different ways. So, just how you perceive yourself. That is it. Thank you.
Good morning, Cathy. The caller who says it is more classism than racism is obviously ill-informed. I mean, you just have to look at the entire private sector. You will see pay gap disparities between blacks and white. The undereducated white people always earn way higher than their black, highly educated counterparts. You know, in these companies, white people always work with their husband, their children, and it's never an issue. But when a black person does the same thing in government, we are told it's nepotism.
Cathy Mohlahlana on SAFM.
All right, so there's still quite a lot you've had to say on the conversation around racism and why it seems so difficult to actually deal with racism. I thought that would have been the last installment, the part 2, but I see that some of you want part 3 of this conversation. I guess beyond just being able to talk about it and understand the issue would be then what are the solutions? How do we fix this problem that we're sitting with? How do we make sure that we are able to have those difficult conversations around race, including in the workplace? And I guess that will be the condition for part 3 of the conversation, is that it must be a conversation that helps us to actually move forward, because the challenges have been identified. They've been explained within the past 2 conversations that we have had. All right, our final conversation for the day is looking at corporate crimes and why it takes so long to investigate corporate crimes, what makes it so difficult, in inverted commas, complex, in inverted commas, as they're often described. David Loxton is a financial forensic investigator. He joins me now. David, good morning.
Morning, Cathy, and morning to your listeners.
David, when we go to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, its findings around the role of corporate South Africa in state capture and the recommendations and referrals that have been made to other state entities, Shamila Batoyi will be among the first that has said numerous times, including in Parliament, that part of the difficulties they've had in investigating the matters is because they don't have the skilled personnel to do it, because these are very difficult and complex matters to try and investigate. Is that true, David? Are they just so difficult that you need highly specialized people, of which only perhaps a few exist in the world, and in South Africa we don't have enough of them?
Yes, that's a very, very difficult question to answer simply, but I think the short answer is yes, it is true. I mean, you take the Steinhoff saga, where there was the investigation in Germany, and I think we can take it as given that Germany is highly efficient in their approach to crime. They've got very, very skilled investigators, very skilled police, very skilled prosecutors. They took 5 years to investigate the Steinhoff matter in Germany. So it's not to say South Africa does not have the skills. We do, but they are in very, very short supply. And unfortunately, the short supply shows up very much in the state resources. We know what happened with state capture. And in fact, it's not unique to South Africa. Governments all around the world underfund projects which they find inconvenient. So in South Africa, the Scorpions and the SAPS and the prosecutors, the NPA, are inconvenient to the instigators of white-collar crime. So there's a deliberate underfunding of that resource. And so one finds that, in fact, what Ms. Batoyi is saying is, in fact, correct. There are the resources, they're in very short supply, and certainly a fraud matter and corruption and white-collar matters are incredibly complex to investigate. Because bear in mind that the state has a very, very high onus of proof, it's beyond reasonable doubt. And so the investigators and the people compiling the evidence to present to a court have to make certain that every single dot is in place and every single T is crossed before they can present that matter to court to have a reasonable prospect of a successful prosecution. And that does take a very, very long time.
And what interests would a state, David, have in underfunding? I guess more broadly, of course, it would be that these investigators don't only work on private cases, they also work on matters around, including the public sector as well. But one would think that in the case of a corporate scandal, such as what we had with Steinhoff, there would be a really great impetus on the state to get to the bottom of it, so that it doesn't happen again. And also because not only was it, government workers' monies that were used to invest in the entity. So there's a direct interest there. But that, for something like this to happen on the scale and on our shores, undetected for so long, I think it's also a blight for us as a country. Surely there must be some reputational damage that the state would also want to see done in this instance.
Yes, you certainly are correct. You would think so, but unfortunately, in South Africa, we did see what came out in the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, that in fact there was the opposite impetus was to, as I've said, to underfund for obvious reasons. When you've got people in government involved in corruption, it's clearly not in their interests to have an efficient apparatus investigating and prosecuting. So, and you don't have one arm of investigators for government and another arm for the private sector. It's one pot. So if the pot is underfunded, then you'll find that there simply aren't the resources to investigate complex financial crimes, whether committed by government officials or by private sector officials. That's the sad state of affairs. And you're quite right. It does impact on our reputation. We saw what's happened with the grey listing of South Africa. We've become a less attractive investment destination when overseas investors perceive that they won't get bang for their buck, and in fact their buck might be stolen. So yes, it can be enormously damaging, and in fact it is enormously damaging.
So in terms of what happens now with the Steinhoff matter, the reality is, even before the events of last week, when Marcus Jooste and his former legal head, I understand, were told that they would be arrested and they had to hand themselves in on Friday. Even up until that point, the time it has taken to investigate this matter and to see any kind of action has long been lamented. Is it justifiable, David, in your view, that it has taken so long to see any kind of action in this matter?
Well, I think justifiable is maybe the wrong word, with all due respect, because what one does see in matters like Steinhoff, and we're seeing it across the board in many other matters, is the individuals involved, they lawyer up, which obviously they're entitled to do, and their legal teams will very often take every technical point under the sun. So there'll be lots of scraps, preliminary scraps about what documents, for example, the individuals are entitled to see. There'll be scraps about the availability of other evidence. Are they entitled to it at certain stages of the investigation, or only once they face the criminal indictment? Those kind of arguments are taking place all the time. And that tends to delay things because, as we all know, when a matter is placed on the court roll anywhere in South Africa, unfortunately, our court rolls are clogged. So if, for example, an individual under investigation brings an application to court to stop the investigation until he or she is in possession of certain documents, that might take a year to 18 months to get to court, if we're lucky, and then the matter is stopped in the interim. So that's what we see all the time is what we all know colloquially is known as the Stalingrad strategy, which was perfected by our former state president. And we saw it throughout and we're still seeing it right now throughout those particular matters. So that can be a large contributing factor to the delays, is the approach of the individuals involved. And I'm not saying that they are wrong, because they certainly are entitled to do what they're doing. Our law does allow it, but it does tend to inordinate delays. And then, as I say, you've got the resource issue of the state not having the hundreds and in fact thousands of individuals at their disposal that they would like to be able to investigate all these matters quickly and efficiently.
And I hear what you're saying, David, but at the same time, though, you're thinking about what happened in Germany. They were ready to go on trial last year already in this matter. And
yes.
And if they were able to put together the kind of evidence that they were confident enough to take on trial, yet this company, is headquartered in South Africa. It's listed in Germany, but it's headquartered in South Africa. And we didn't seem to be anywhere near where they were with their investigations. So it still doesn't make sense to me, David.
Yes, I can hear the frustration in your voice, and I believe you me, I share your frustration. Look, if you speak to German lawyers, and I've been in the fortunate position of working with many German lawyers on cross-jurisdictional matters, it's quite funny that they will tell you that they find their justice system very, very slow and cumbersome and inefficient. They'll complain that the police are underpaid and under-resourced in Germany. We in South Africa sit here and we say, wow, we would love to be like the Germans. And if that's what they call under-resourced and inefficient, well, we take it any day of the week. I think it's common knowledge that South Africa, we are in the unfortunate position that to a large extent, our institutions have been hollowed out and, as I say, under-resourced. So we have got a major capacity problem in this country with investigating these complex matters. And so the Germans, I think, were in the happy position of being better resourced and able to throw better resources at the matter, which made it far quicker for them. So I think that is one of the major contributing factors to the Germans getting to court a lot quicker than what we did in South Africa.
What happens in an instance like this, David, where you now have, of course, Marcus Jooste, who was the protagonist in this matter? He's now gone. So the investigations, yes, we're told, will continue without him. But of course, in as far as him being the person who's at the center, and in fact, the Germans accuse him of being the architect of this scandal, of this accounting scandal, he's now no longer around to answer. We saw something similar happen with Bosasa and Gavin Watson when he died in the midst of the storm that he was facing. So ultimately, the perception around accountability and prosecution of crimes, in particular white-collar crimes, is that it just doesn't happen. Now, is that perception just that, or is it a reality? As somebody who deals and works as a financial forensic investigator.
Look, I think the perception is in fact a correct one. Unfortunately, and I know I keep repeating myself, because of the under-resourcing in this country, it does take a long time to get matters to court and to get them properly investigated. As an aside, you can imagine what's going to happen now in the Steinhoff matter is every single other person that's implicated will blame Mr. Jooste because Mr. Jooste is not around now to defend himself. So we know that's the way that's going to go down. But the matters I've been involved in over the years have been extraordinarily frustrating in the sense that you can act for a corporate client, put all the evidence together, hand it to the SAPS, and there it seems to die a natural death, or just nothing happens. And so, I've had quite a few clients that will brief me on a matter, and we'll then gather the evidence to present to the SAP services. And then the client then just gets very frustrated where 2 or 3 years later, nothing has happened. And they say, well, we spent all this money with you to gather the evidence and for us to fulfill our civic duty as good corporate citizens, but unfortunately nothing's happening. So we're not going to spend any more money on this. So close your file. And that is unfortunately reality in South Africa. And what I've said to you is repeated across the board by all my counterparts who also are doing their best to investigate and assist proceedings. So I think in a long-winded way, what I'm saying to you is, yes, the perception is reality. It's not to say there are not good people in the police services or they're not good prosecutors, but unfortunately, the general perception is that there is no accountability, and that is borne out with the truth and in reality.
I guess the natural question to arise from what you've just said, David, is that if forensic investigators like yourself can uncover some level of evidence and truth that could well be able to contribute to a criminal case, why would the police not also do that? Especially given the fact that if you're giving them information, you've literally told them where to go and look to find the skeletons or to find the buried bodies, and you've made their work so much easier than what it would have been if they had to uncover it from scratch. So it does raise a big question. Michaels, you're in Kabeja. Good morning.
Morning, Katie. Your guest, I'm not buying what your guest is saying there. You know, Steinhoff paid a whole lot of money to the NPA to assist them in investigating this issue, right? That's one side of it. When it comes to maybe in the KZN or Edwin Sodi or whoever, it's quick. They are quick to be charged, and they are in court and so on and so forth. But with Marcus, we are under-resourced and so on. But the other side, I'm coming to you, the media. It is interesting that not one media house calls Marcus Jooste a criminal. None. Actually, this weekend's newspaper, he was labeled as a genius. He was called a genius of Marcus Jooste's greed. But this is the biggest criminal fraud in South Africa's history. This issue here. So I just wanted to make these two comments.
Yeah, look, I hear you, Michaels, but it's not true that the NPA says it's under-resourced only in matters like your Marcus Jooste matters. I think that's a general position that they've taken across the board. And that's part of the reason why they say they haven't been able to fully investigate the findings and recommendations of the Zondo Commission because they're not capacitated enough.
Is Katie, but when it comes to other, let's say, Madam Kumete or Edwin Sodi or Ace Makashule, it's quick.
Exactly. Michaels, I think you're raising an issue that we can put to David. David, is it easier to investigate corruption in the public sector than it is in the private sector? And I wonder what the reasons may be.
You know, I would say, as a general proposition, it's probably harder to investigate in the public sector simply because of record keeping. I've done investigations in the public sector where there's been widespread sharing of passwords, where there's been no documentation kept, or where documents are kept. They're literally, you'd find a couple of thousand files tossed into an office somewhere with no filing system in place. Whereas in the private sector, because of their resources, they will have proper filing systems in place, they have proper segregation. So in fact, it's much easier to investigate in the private sector than the public, as simply gathering the evidence. So as a general proposition, I would say that the private sector is generally easier, simply because of the record keeping and the controls and the checks and balances in place.
So is Michaels right then that there must be some kind of greater agenda for why we see more prosecutions, I use the term loosely in inverted commas, in the public sector than we do in private?
Look, I don't know if that's necessarily correct. I think probably the general perception, and it's probably borne out by the facts, is that because of the amount of money involved in the public sector, that is where the big spend comes. There are far more instances of corruption and kickbacks and bribery within the government sector than in the private sector. So I think it's just simply a matter of volume, that the perception is that prosecutions are taking place more in the public than the private sector. Also, I think I need to repeat what I said earlier. You take something like the Steinhoff matter, that is a very, very complex financial fraud, which takes very, very select skills to investigate. Whereas the public sector, there's a lot more, not necessarily easier, but less complex issues at stake. There's a lot in the procurement space, for example, where it simply involves the payment of bribes and kickbacks. That's way easier to investigate than fiddling of the books by a skilled chartered accountant.
All right. David Loxton, we're going to have to leave it there for this morning. He's a financial forensic investigator. It's time for your latest headlines.
Thank you, Cathy. In your headlines, National Assembly Speaker Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula's urgent application has been adjourned until 3 o'clock this afternoon in the High Court in Pretoria. Mapisa-Nqakula launched the application to seek to interdict police from arresting her. The fourth accused in the disappearance of 6-year-old Jocelyn Smith will be back before the Vredenburg Magistrates Court in the Western Cape on May 13th. 32-year-old Laurentia Lombard abandoned her bail application when she made a second appearance in court this morning. The South African Medical Association has called on the Gauteng Health Department to urgently settle its telecom bill issue as hospitals remain unreachable. This also means that ambulance services and families of patients in the hospitals cannot contact families in hospitals such as the Chris Hani Baragwanath, Charlotte Maxeke, or the Steve Biko Academic Hospitals. I'll have details on these and other stories at 12.
The Talking Point with Cathy Mohlahlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
Well, this feature, which is our final conversation of the day, is brought to you by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. The Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, in partnership with the Industrial Development Corporation, the National Empowerment Fund and the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, hosted the second Black Industrialists and Exporters Conference at the Sandton International Convention Centre on the 20th of March 2024. The objective of the Black Industrialist Program is to increase the participation of Black South Africans in the ownership and control of productive enterprises in key sectors and value chains of the country's economy. Tsepo Ramodibe is the head of corporate affairs at the IDC. Tsepo, good morning.
Good morning, Cathy.
Let's talk about then this conference that you've held, Black Industrialists and Exporters Conference. What is the aim of it?
Cathy, if you recall, the Black Industrialist Program was officially initiated in 2016. So this really just made it 8 years since the start. But this year's conference fortuitously coincided with the 20th anniversary of the Black Economic Empowerment Act. And all of this really speaks to inclusive participation in the economy. But this program was really targeted at, active participants in the economy, the Black industrialists. And these are entrepreneurs that are directly involved in the management of the operations and not just shareholders. So they are actively involved in manufacturing of goods and providing services. So this is really an opportunity to take stock as to the impact of the program, engage with the industrialists themselves to get insights, on some of the things that could be done to improve the impact of the program. But this year's innovational element was really getting the private sector and public sector to really stand up and be counted. There were commitments made by each of them on their spend with Black industrialists for the next 5 years, and that was a critical milestone and a highlight of this year's conference, Cathy.
When we talk about a Black industrialist, how do we define who a Black industrialist is? What does this person need to be doing to qualify?
And I'll take you back to the definition. And I think when you look at the Act itself, the BEE Act, is that we're looking at entrepreneurs that are, highly involved who create value, in the industrial, process. They have more than 50% ownership. And they wake up every day, Cathy, and I think that's the differentiator. So we've had a number of people that are shareholders in going concerns, but go to board meetings, but never really actively involved, are not on the shop floor. So the Black industrialists, and what separates them is that active involvement in the industrial enterprise. You wake up every day, you know what the inputs, what the outputs are, the costs and the impact on the ground, which is really about creating jobs. And I think, Cathy, that should really be our, clear definition. But for us as the industrialists themselves, the part and parcel of, the increase of economic activity, which is critical for us because they directly create jobs, in an inclusive economy.
Is there a particular value that their business must have in order to, again, fit the criteria of an industrialist?
Not, Cathy, and that, people could start off as a small enterprise, scale up to medium to large and grow. So there isn't a criterion across the entire financing landscape. We do have financiers that support these kind of entrepreneurs at different levels. So whether you're talking to, SIFA, Small Enterprise Finance Agency, even at a provincial level, you've got the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller that support entrepreneurs at different levels. And as you scale up, then you're able to have a conversation with the likes of the NEF and the IDC, because the quantum that you're looking for is in excess of millions of rand, and perhaps even into the billions. But also when you do access the grant facilities available at the DTIC, you would be at that level, but there isn't really an entry where you literally say there's the minimum, there's the maximum, Cathy. I think any entrepreneur looking, for funding, $1 million and above, could engage the DTIC, the IDC or the NEF and qualify then under the Black Industrialist Program.
One of the things I remember when this program was launched in 2016 is that part of the idea behind it was to try and create black billionaires. And that was really to say that people that will build up businesses in different sectors that can really be formidable in their industries. We, of course, have seen what is a rise of whether it's white or Afrikaans billionaires in this country post-democracy. Much of it is, it's evidence and documented in books, etc. Have we seen that for black individuals? And would you say that that is still one of the objectives of this program? Do we call it a program of black industrialists?
Cathy, we are, established entrepreneurs, and I think when people aspire to be a billionaire, there's got to be a foundation and a growth in that particular enterprise. And what we're seeing across the board and what we witnessed and saw at the convention center last week were entrepreneurs with a long history who've worked in their, particular sectors. They know it intimately, and they are growing organically. And for them, it's not necessarily the ambition of being a billionaire. That will come in time. Their current ambition right now is to be leaders in their particular sector, be able to increase market access, export their products in a way that their business grow, they employ more people, they're able to contribute to the economy in a meaningful way. And the billionaire outcome will come in the end, but it's progressive. And I think the ambition that most have, on the sidelines, Cathy, that you would become an automatic billionaire is not feasible. It hasn't worked. We have not seen that. But what we've seen, even from an IDC perspective, are entrepreneurs that are able to access loan facilities, service those loans, repay back, come back again to get additional funding to grow their businesses even more. And when they do require support to take their goods outside of the country, that's something that we've seen. And I think that's what we need to encourage, the growth and entrenchment of this entrepreneurial spirit. But, entrepreneurs that are involved. And I think in time that will come. What we did see even at the conference itself, Cathy, was recognition of industrialists in various sectors of our economy, whether it's in manufacturing, agro-processing, mining and metals, infrastructure, and energy. And these are companies that we need to applaud, because in time, cumulatively, they will then, contribute to more jobs. They will contribute to, GDP, and they themselves will grow to the point where, that status that everybody aspires to, comes as a logical outcome. So that's the positive. I think from an IDC perspective, Cathy, you look at over the last 5 years, for instance, 23.5 billion that we've invested, provided funding support to 328 industrialists, and that's critical for us. It's a critical injection in the real economy where these businesses are able to run day-to-day operations, create jobs, contribute to the economy, especially in critical sectors that we really need.
Tsepo, why do you believe that your event last week was a success? What were you able to accomplish?
I think the main thing, Cathy, was getting everybody into the room. You look at we had over 1,000, just under 1,500 guests. And these are just delegates and exhibitors. This excludes, key captains of industry that attended, government leaders that also attended. But I think more than anything else, the main takeaway was a reaffirmation of the critical partnership between the private and public sectors in supporting Black industrialists, not only procuring from them, but where there's an opportunity to support the industrialists with market access. Those are some of the conversations taking place. But the main highlight that everybody would have seen was the 261 billion that has been committed for procurement by both the private and public sectors. And this is really to support, this is all from, 239 Black industrialists supporting other, industrialists to grow. And I think, as the President noted, that this confirmed a commitment by all, that inclusive participation in the economy is a given. And with the targeted finance available from the DTIC, the IDC itself, and the NEF, and also our colleagues at the Export Credit Insurance Agency, that there is a concert and agreement around the need to be very supportive of this Black industrialist grouping, and which is critical for the economy. So if those were, that would be the summary, Cathy, the key takeaways. But for us would be, in the next 5 years, year on year, we're going to be seeing the growth of these businesses. And as they grow, not only are more jobs created, but there'll be an even more better contribution to the GDP, to the economy, which is what South Africa needs at this particular point in time. So that's why the conference was an important milestone. And we look forward to tracking and reporting back to society on the impact of the program and these pledges over the next 5 years.
Tsepo Ramudibe is the head of corporate affairs at the IDC, and this conversation has been brought to you by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. All right, that's where it brings us to the end of our show for this Monday morning, or soon to be afternoon. Of course, the Talking Point is back with you again tomorrow between 9 and midday. Up next is the update at noon. Before we get to it, it's the book reading.
The Industrial Development Corporation, IDC, believes in the power of transformation and driving sustainable economic growth. We're not just financiers. We're architects of opportunity and partners in shaping our communities for a shared, brighter tomorrow. Our mandate for inclusivity in the economy is the reason we fund Black industrialists, Black-owned companies, women, and youth-empowered enterprises. Speak to us for tailored funding support and let us catalyze industries and create jobs together. The IDC.
The book reading. Please note the views expressed in this book are not that of the station. Listeners' discretion is advised. SFM presents another episode of Why Men Hate Women, written by Kopano Ratile.
Love, as I have said, can be thought of as a particular form of caring and being cared for. A domestic worker does not love her employer's children, although she takes care of them. It may be for this reason that while love is not mentioned, the term care is used in several places in the plan and is mentioned as one of its 6 pillars. In this regard, care is seen as a necessary component of services by the state and civil society that victims and survivors of gender-based violence and their families require to recover and heal. Care is also referred to in connection with the emotional, physical, and financial care that falls on women, especially black women, and the unpaid care work that they perform. And it is mentioned with respect to Zella care centers and to the care needs of healthcare victims and survivors. Another reason for the absence of love as love in the plan may be that it is unusual for the idea of love to be centered in work against violence. Working against violence does not usually entail working toward loving gender relations. The raison d'etre of anti-violence project is, of course, to end violence, an impossible goal, or to reduce it, which is more achievable depending on the target set. Yet, since men's violence against those whom they are close expresses lovelessness, love seems to bookend violence on either side. The beginning of sexual love promises a life untouched by willful violence, or at least it should. The end of violence promises the beginning of not just peace, but also love, or at least it should. Of course, to be denied love is to experience something akin to psychical violence. But as I've contended, love is both a subjective feeling and a social force. It satisfies personal needs, but also bonds us to others within the social groups to which we belong, such as the shared idolization of the Kaizer Chiefs Football Club among its fans. Although in many such non-intimate cases, love might not always be referred to as such. We minimize our need to be regarded with love, at least to be regarded as if we are loved, as if we matter by social institutions, bosses and underlings, religious leaders, God and the state, because we misperceive the power of love as a social good. A satisfying life implies more than a life free of violence. Typically, people expect not to be hurt by those close to them, emotionally or physically. It is not virtuous to expect not to be harmed unless we live in a time of war or in a society riddled with conflict. We need love, or care at least, from those who are close to us precisely because such closeness suggests intimacy, belonging. And we look for recognition, whether from inmates, acquaintances or strangers, which is to say, first to be treated with Botho. For as I have said, love is an intensification of Botho. Such recognition communicates to us our inherent value, even our love-worthiness. There may also be a view that, in contrast to violence, which feminism has convinced us is a social issue, love must remain private. There may be a feeling that to talk about sexual love, we have to pry into people's homes, hearts, or psyches. This is not necessary when it comes to violence, which we can march against. And yet, one reason why many women and men who have been sexually violated in intimate relationships feel shame and never speak about their experiences is precisely because talking about violence in our close relationships can sometimes be even more private matter than talking about love. At the same time, like violence, thinking of love as an element of Botho makes it available as a cultural force. We can demand that the state show us love. We can march for love. We can write love into our policies. All of this should not be read as a rejection of the National Strategic Plan because it ignores the hunger for love in men and boys. I cannot expect that the plan, which has women and non-conforming individuals at its center, should also devote resources to the effects of lovelessness in contributing to the perpetration of violence by men. While I see it as crucial to pay attention to the lack of caring attention to boys so that we can guide them away from forms of masculinity configured around toughness, risk, and violence towards more compassionate and emotionally connected forms, we cannot expect women who want to end violence against women to do the work of loving boys for us. That task of nurturing loving masculinities must fall on those of us who are interested in the question of the making of